Long before the Erd Tree stood tall, and long before anyone claimed divinity over the lands between, a stranger lived across the ocean. No golden laws existed yet, no thrones sat in high castles. Instead, there was just a man from an isolated place. Yet his actions would eventually bend the future of the entire world to his will. His name was Hoarah-Loux. He ruled as chieftain over the Badlands. This territory lay far away from the continent, hidden past the Sea of Fog. Life in the Badlands demanded strength above all else, forcing its people to survive through constant struggle against the elements and each other. No records survive to detail his childhood. We have no texts explaining who his parents were or how many winters he fought through to earn his title. History is completely silent regarding his youth. By the time his name appears in our accounts, his climb to power is already finished. He stands entirely unchallenged. He is the ultimate authority in his homeland. Every warrior who rode beside him respected his raw power. They marched under his command without hesitation and knew better than to ever stand against him in battle. Life in the Badlands offered no comfort. Survival required absolute physical power. Hoarah-Loux ruled a society that judged a person solely by their victories on the battlefield. If a fighter could strike down an opponent, they earned respect. If they failed, they were quickly forgotten. His people cast aside useless traditions. They had no interest in shiny armor or decorated halls. Everything they touched served a practical purpose in combat. A warrior needed only muscle, steel, and a focused mind to conquer enemies. They wore basic clothing, leaving their skin exposed to the wind and the sun. This stripped-down lifestyle defined their daily routine. We can see this philosophy clearly in the relics they left behind. Specifically, a simple leather strap known as the champion headband. Only the bravest fighters earned the right to tie this cloth around their brows. It functioned as a clear badge of honor. It proved the wearer had survived countless battles and walked away alive every single time. Hoarah-Loux established this exact tradition. He threw away all royal luxuries from his own shoulders. He stepped onto the battlefield wearing the absolute minimum, relying instead on his brute strength. The men and women under his command mirrored his behavior perfectly. They copied his fighting stance. They wore the same plain garments. He shaped an entire generation of warriors by living exactly the way he wanted them to live. Warriors of this harsh land favored axes above all other arms. Swords required finesse, and spears kept enemies at a distance. The fighters of the Badlands preferred to close the gap and strike with crushing force. A heavy blade attached to a thick wooden handle suited their combat style perfectly. Hoarah-Loux personally championed this weapon. He carried a massive axe into every skirmish, breaking through shields and armor with ease. His followers watched his success and adopted the exact same armament. Historical relics from that era prove how deeply this fighting style took root. Heavy talismans made of iron and the stories of the chieftain's own legendary weapon show a military tradition that survived for generations. Young fighters continued to train with axes long after his reign ended. The weapon became a clear icon of their culture. Carrying one signaled a person's allegiance to their leader and their commitment to a brutal lifestyle. No previous king passed a crown down to Hoarah-Loux. No gods reached down from the sky to grant him authority. He claimed his position strictly through raw effort. The Badlands bred ruthless killers, yet he stood above them all as the most lethal fighter in the territory. Every time a rival stepped forward, Hoarah-Loux walked away the victor. He outlasted countless challengers and survived battles that claimed the lives of his peers. In a society that respected only muscle and spilled blood, he proved his superiority daily. He possessed a commanding physical presence. A single look from him warned everyone nearby to keep their weapons sheathed. Long before the rest of the world learned his identity, he had already mastered his own hostile homeland. Far across the Sea of Fog, a different kind of conquest was taking shape. Queen Marika the Eternal had begun constructing a new system of law and faith. She called this empire the Golden Order. At the center of her ambition stood the Erd Tree. This massive tree radiated light across the continent, acting as the physical anchor for her rule. Marika intended to govern every single thing touched by its golden grace. Her campaign was highly successful. She steadily pulled vast regions of the lands between under her direct control. Her forces marched outward and absorbed independent territories into her kingdom. Ancient races, giant beasts, and rival lords fell to their knees before her banner. Marika systematically defeated any civilization that refused to submit to her authority. However, royal declarations alone could not conquer every enemy. Some foes ignored her holy decrees. These battles required absolute destruction to secure a victory. She faced brutal wars that demanded a general capable of wading through blood and breaking enemy lines with ease. Marika required a military commander who thrived entirely on combat. She needed a champion possessing enough raw power to crush stubborn resistance and guide her armies through completely hostile battlefields. The chieftain of the Badlands fit this requirement perfectly. Hora Lu lived only for war. This focused aggression made him the exact weapon Marika needed to finish conquering the land. History keeps the details of their initial encounter a secret. No surviving scrolls document the day Queen Marika crossed paths with the warrior from beyond the ocean. We lack any eyewitness accounts of the exact moment the immortal ruler laid eyes on the fierce chieftain and recognized his potential. Scribes never wrote down what words they exchanged. We only know she saw a man capable of breaking any obstacle in her path and decided to claim him for her cause. The results of this decision permanently altered the foundation of the world. Queen Marika elevated Hora Lu to stand beside her as her royal consort. By making this choice, she merged two completely opposite forces. She took the brutal strength of a foreign fighter and combined it with the radiant magic of her growing empire. This alliance forged an unprecedented era of conquest. To signify this massive shift in his destiny, the chieftain cast aside his old identity. Marika bestowed a fresh title upon him. He stepped into the light of the Erd Tree as Godfrey, the first Elden Lord. He traded his rank of tribal leader for a crown that commanded the armies of an entire continent. Their marriage produced a completely new dynasty alongside their military alliance. Marika and Godfrey brought forth offspring who carried both raw power and holy grace in their veins. These children stood as the inaugural demigods of the realm. If we examine the ancient script carved into Godric's great rune, the physical artifact confirms this history without any doubt. It states clearly that the original demigods descended directly from Elden Lord Godfrey and his heirs, establishing the mighty family known as the Golden Lineage. Long before the Night of the Black Knives claimed its victims, and long before the shattering broke the continent into scattered ruins, a clear era of foundation existed. A queen, possessing pure golden grace, and a warlord shaped by freezing winds stood firmly united. Together, they established a completely new royal family. This specific bloodline would eventually birth the strongest individuals in recorded history. Many of these descendants would go on to rule vast castles and command large armies. Yet, intense sorrow ultimately awaited every single one of them. Those days of collapse remained far away in the future. The immediate reality promised only thick smoke and spilled blood. Queen Marika expected her husband to wage endless war. She never planned to let him rest inside a comfortable palace or attend royal banquets. She demanded a ruthless general to clear her path and secure absolute dominance over every corner of the realm. Her newly crowned king received clear orders to march outward and crush all remaining resistance. The lands between still held fierce populations refusing to submit to the Erd Tree. Massive giants hurled flames from the peaks of snowy mountains. Lords of the Storm commanded cutting winds from high stone fortresses. Ancient dragons soared through the clouds, wielding lightning older than Marika's own faith. All these factions stood ready to defend their territories. In response, Godfrey, the first Elden Lord, simply gripped his heavy axe and stepped forward. He marched directly onto the battlefield, completely prepared to conquer the continent by force. Queen Marika refused to simply place a golden crown on a wild chieftain and expect him to adapt. Elevating Hoaraloo to royalty required a severe personal change. The transition from a wandering fighter to an imperial monarch came with a heavy price. He would physically carry the burden of this alteration on his back for his entire existence. A serious flaw threatened his ability to stand beside a deity and govern a newly forged kingdom. The man was built entirely for slaughter. Ancient texts describe his condition plainly. A ceaseless lust for battle boiled endlessly in his veins. This aggressive instinct refused to calm down or fade away. His pulse raced constantly with a violent urge, pushing his mind to seek out fresh conflicts and new opponents every single day. This raging internal fire served him perfectly back home. It fueled his rise to dominance and made him a living nightmare for anyone foolish enough to draw a weapon against him. Marika valued this exact ferocity when she needed a commander to break enemy armies and conquer the continent. Yet ruling an empire requires an entirely different approach. A king must learn to stay seated on a throne. He needs to listen to court advisors, organize supply lines, and manage the daily administration of a sprawling capital city. The first Elden Lord had to present a dignified image to his subjects and operate smoothly inside a strict religious hierarchy. A berserker who constantly struggles against the urge to snap the necks of visiting diplomats cannot manage a functional government. To survive in royal society and act as a true sovereign, the champion required external help to suppress his own violent nature. To officially secure his royal title, the warlord made a binding promise. He understood his aggressive nature needed a strict leash. He solved this problem by attaching a physical anchor directly to his body. He permitted a massive lion named Serosh, known widely as the Beast Regent, to ride him. The Godfrey icon talisman documents this exact event. The relic explains his choice perfectly. And when he vowed to become a lord, he took the beast regent Sirosh upon his back to suppress that ceaseless battle lust burning inside him. Instead of forming a normal alliance, the new king intentionally chained himself to a living warden. Sirosh functioned as an active dampener for the man's violent urges. The beast dug his claws in and remained permanently fixed to the monarch. Whenever the ruler entered a silent throne room or stood in a crowded military camp, the giant lion stayed firmly anchored to his shoulders. This constant physical weight kept the commander's mind calm and ensured he governed his newly forged kingdom with steady hands. Sirosh took the form of a massive lion. He possessed immense physical strength and stood far taller than any normal beast. His thick fur had faded to a deep shade of grey. A crown of silver hair surrounded his face. His clouded eyes lacked sight. They carried the heavy marks of ancient battles and showed the long passage of centuries. Long before this era, back when he still possessed his youth, that same mane shone with a bright gold colour. The heavy weapon known as the Beast Claw Greathammer carries his legacy today. This large hammer names him the Lord of Beasts. History also records his eventual position as a regent for Godfrey. No one viewed this creature as a simple prize of the hunt or a captured animal. Sirosh commanded respect on his own terms and held real authority among men. The thick metal of the golden beast crest shield honors his name. The shield describes him as a counselor of great age. He offered trusted guidance to the rulers of the golden lineage. Plates of silver armor covered his frame. He possessed vast knowledge and acted with clear intent. From the exact instant he climbed onto Godfrey's shoulders, his main mission began. He needed to contain the chieftain's endless rage. He existed to restrain the warrior from his own violent instincts. Anyone facing the first Elden Lord in combat would witness this relationship in action. Sirosh clung to the king's back as a phantom. The beast drove his teeth directly into Godfrey's left shoulder. He locked his jaw. The lion actively pulled backward against the warrior's sudden impulses. He fought to keep the chieftain's endless bloodlust in check. Every swing of the great axe carried this invisible weight. Whenever Godfrey stomped the earth or delivered a strike, Sirosh absorbed the sheer fury of the motion. The counselor filtered Horalu's raw instinct through a wall of strict suppression. Challengers faced a heavily restrained fighter. The immense force of these attacks came from a warrior bound by a spirit chain. Yet he still possessed the strength to crush the ground beneath his boots. Consider the reality of his long reign. The king held meetings with ambitious generals. He presided over formal ceremonies inside the capital of Lanedale. He spent countless hours standing within grand chambers and pacing the quiet halls of a golden kingdom. The phantom beast remained attached to his back through all of those peaceful moments. Sirosh performed his duty without a second of rest. The lion kept his jaws tight on the man's flesh. He maintained a firm boundary between the civilized ruler Horalu promised to become and the violent savage he remained beneath the surface. The chieftain paid a steep price for his royal vow. He surrendered his true nature every single morning. This daily tax demanded his submission for as long as Godfrey lived. Sirosh held a position of vast importance for the entire golden lineage. His influence extended far past his daily duty to the first Elden Lord. the image of the beast transformed into the official crest of a rising dynasty. Marching armies wore his face into battle. Foot soldiers proudly displayed the lion insignia across their cloth surcoats. Blacksmiths hammered the creature's likeness onto heavy shields, while royal guards walked the capital wearing armor decorated with his visage. Within the ranks of the Golden Order, this emblem carried massive weight. The beast stood for Godfrey's absolute authority and the strict discipline required to maintain an empire. Records regarding Radahn's lion armor provide clear proof of this shared identity. The text states that the golden lion symbolized Godfrey the Elden Lord and his beast regent Siraj together as one unified force. General Radahn idolized this combined image from his earliest days as a boy. The young demigod stared in awe at the legendary lord of the battlefield and sought to replicate that immense strength. The king and his counselor became a towering icon of martial pride. Countless generations of younger warriors looked up to this standard long after both figures vanished from the realm. A lasting legacy of this magnitude requires a foundation of absolute truth. The bond between the chieftain and the beast possessed genuine weight, forged through decades of mutual respect. The bond linking the king to his beast went far deeper than a simple political emblem. Their existences merged completely. When Godfrey marched into brutal wars, the lion rode with him. Siraj maintained his rigid grip through decades of combat. Eventually, the light of grace abandoned the ruler. He faced banishment from the kingdom and crossed the misty sea. The fallen lord led his warriors on a harsh journey across the outside world. During this long march through foreign wastelands, the Phantom Counselor stayed firmly attached to his back. Even when the chieftain finally died in battle, the lion remained by his side. Long after their burial, a golden light pierced the darkness of their grave. Grace called the Tarnished back to their homeland, and the two resurrected as a single entity. Through this massive journey, Siraj never abandoned his duty. He enforced the agreement exactly as he promised on the day Hoarah-Loux claimed the crown. His jaws held tight. This lifelong pact would shatter only once. The king would eventually make a fatal choice at the base of the Elden Throne. He would decide to sever the partnership with his own hands. However, that violent conclusion belongs to a later chapter. We must remain in the past for now. We must clearly understand the exact nature of this man as he took his first steps onto the battlefield. When Godfrey raised his axe as the first Elden Lord, he carried the deadliest part of his own soul on his back. The ancient lion clamped down on his flesh to fulfill a strict duty. Siraj had to guarantee that a composed king arrived to command the troops. He absorbed the chieftain's endless rage so the ruler could issue clear orders. Even with this heavy restriction holding his true strength hostage, he forged an unmatched legacy. He rose to become the most feared military leader in the history of the realm. This burdened fighter marched his forces up the snowy peaks to slaughter the fire giants. This same warrior later walked into the howling winds of Limgrave to challenge the Stormlord in single combat. His physical power reached such an overwhelming peak that he simply could not wear a crown without a spirit beast anchoring his mind. Queen Marika knew exactly what she was doing when she chose him. The brutal campaigns ahead would soon demonstrate exactly why her rising empire demanded a monster on a leash. The early days of Marika's reign ran red with blood. The birth of her era required constant conflict across the continent. Before the queen established her kingdom, older factions controlled the soil. These ancient groups possessed immense strength and heavily guarded their ancestral lands. They held clear, valid motives to fight back against the empire she wanted to build. A rising god must seize control of a realm through absolute force. The newly planted Erd Tree demanded total submission from the surrounding regions. Marika needed an unstoppable vanguard to crush the opposition, and she ordered Godfrey to clear her path with steel. The heavy plates of the Elden Lord armor document his legendary campaigns. Every piece of this 4-part set shares the exact same text. The gear spells out his military achievements plainly. The inscription declares that the age of the Erd Tree began among conflict. During those bloody years, Godfrey was lord of the battlefield. The items record how he led the war against the giants and how he faced the Stormlord alone. Once his axe struck down his final worthy opponent, an unexpected shift overtook the king. A sudden change occurred within his mind that shocked the entire capital. We will examine that event later on. Right now, we must direct our focus to the front lines. The first Elden Lord always brought a formidable vanguard with him into the fray. He directed a specialized military unit that completely redefined warfare across the continent. The realm came to know this heavy infantry group as the Crucible Knights. The text of the Crucible Axe Helm details their exact rank within the hierarchy. The bronze helmet confirms these warriors swore absolute loyalty to Godfrey directly. Their immense strength originated from the primordial crucible. Before the glowing Erd Tree dominated the sky and forced strict rules onto the land, this ancient state of biology held sway. During the dawn of the world, existence possessed a chaotic nature. All life melted together in a massive pool of raw vitality. Godfrey's elite troops channeled this untamed force straight through their veins. They bound the wild energy into their thick copper armor. These fighters functioned as walking relics of an era that predated Marika's new religion. 2 highly skilled captains maintained strict discipline within their ranks. Ordovis stood at the head of the axe-wielding contingent. He required every soldier in his division to bear his personal crest. His followers wore a specific axe emblem stamped boldly on their gear. Meanwhile, Siluria commanded a separate wing known as the Tree Knights. These 2 distinct divisions merged to form the king's ultimate weapon. They marched at the absolute front of his massive armies. Whenever the early Golden Order declared war on a new territory, Ordovis and Siluria broke the enemy lines first. We must stop to examine the tragedy behind these warriors. The Crucible Knights laid the physical foundation for the modern era. Before Marika's empire stood tall, these soldiers cleared the way with their massive weapons. They waged brutal campaigns to guarantee the Erd Tree's absolute supremacy over the continent. Their bodies took deep wounds to raise a kingdom that would rapidly grow into a dominant force across the realm. As the years passed and the ruling class secured its power, the Golden Religion shifted its values. The priests looked at the veterans who won their wars and saw only a threat. The brass plating of the crucible axe gauntlets documents this shift in public opinion clearly. The armor states that as society changed, the raw might of these soldiers drew bitter disgust. Citizens began to view the animal horn and thick tail incantations of their magic as messy and impure. The knights earned open contempt from the exact civilization they bled to establish. The same individuals who cemented the New Age soon found themselves banished to the fringes of society. This massive hypocrisy formed the rotting core of the future empire. During the king's active reign, however, no such prejudice existed. Godfrey valued raw strength above all else. He claimed these warriors as his absolute own. They stood as the most lethal combatants to walk the earth, and they marched loyally behind the chieftain into every single conflict he commanded. To truly grasp the massive scale of Godfrey's military record, one would have to read through a seemingly endless list of individual battles. A single piece of ancient history summarizes his heavy burden perfectly. Before the Golden Light ruled the land, every single force on the continent stood in absolute opposition to the Erd Tree. Every ancient tribe and resisting faction fought aggressively against its growing influence. The Shining Tree only became the physical embodiment of order after an unending string of military triumphs. The first Elden Lord served as the blunt weapon that forced this new reality into existence. Whenever a rival power collapsed into the dirt, Godfrey held the axe. Whenever an older civilization surrendered its territory to the spreading golden rays, this chieftain stood at the center of the conquest. He personally dismantled every obstacle blocking the kingdom's rapid expansion. Queen Merica openly acknowledged his massive contribution to her cause. Her original words still linger across the realm in the form of spoken memories. These vocal fragments remain perfectly preserved at specific holy sites where she originally delivered her royal speeches. A traveler resting at the ruins of the First Church of Merica can experience this lingering magic and hear her historic address. In this specific message, the goddess speaks directly to Godfrey and his battle-worn troops right after they concluded their brutal campaign against the giants. The queen praises their relentless efforts in the snow. She reminds her army that divine guidance steered their weapons through the harshest fighting to reach their current victorious position. She then issues a strict final command to execute the remaining giants and permanently seal their ruinous fire at the highest peak of the mountain. With that ultimate threat safely contained, she shifts her vision toward the future. Merica anticipates the birth of a completely new epoch built entirely on their blood and sacrifice. She promises her warriors a kingdom, one glistening with life. She officially crowns this incoming era the Age of the Erd Tree. Queen Merica delivered a speech that functioned equally as a royal blessing and a strict military directive. She openly admitted a simple truth to her exhausted forces. The sheer violence committed by Godfrey and his loyal troops laid the absolute bedrock for her rising empire. If the chieftain failed to secure those brutal victories, the Age of the Erd Tree would never happen. Her glowing tree demanded conquered territory to grow tall and cast its light. The heavy weapons of the Crucible Knights broke through ancient defenses to make this new reality possible. They marched forward to slaughter old factions that walked the earth long before the Golden Religion took shape. The first Elden Lord supplied the raw muscle that forced the entire continent into submission. He stood as the literal engine behind America's supreme authority. Throughout these endless seasons of slaughter, the Phantom Lion stayed clamped to his master's flesh. Sirosh rode the king into every single skirmish across the map. He remained firmly attached during strategic planning sessions with exhausted generals. The beast held fast through formal gatherings with wealthy nobles in the capital. The counselor maintained his relentless grip to ensure the vow survived. Whenever the savage warrior screamed to break free from his mental cage, the beast pulled back harder. The civilized ruler maintained his composure and commanded the room. Hoarah honored his heavy promise to the goddess without fail. However, a life entirely dedicated to endless warfare faces a massive obstacle once the fighting stops. A commanding general can only claim a finite amount of land. A marching army will eventually run out of rival nations to crush beneath its boots. An urgent question arises for a fierce combatant like Hoarah. What fate awaits a man who defines his entire existence by the thrill of a deadly challenge once the continent runs out of capable challengers? The thick plates of the Elden Lord armor provide a quiet answer to this dilemma. The item description reveals a sudden shift within the conqueror. When the last worthy enemy fell, the hue of Godfrey's eyes faded. His long crusade finally reached its conclusion. The chieftain had no more banners to burn and no more kings to decapitate. This absolute victory triggered a rapid collapse. The peace he achieved signaled the immediate downfall of the exact life he sacrificed everything to build. Godfrey waged countless brutal wars to secure the continent for the Golden Order. However, a single massive conflict defined his legacy more than any other clash. The bloody push into the high snows carried immense weight for the future of the kingdom. This crusade against the giants served as the ultimate test. Victory here would guarantee the birth of the Age of the Erd Tree. Defeat meant the absolute collapse of the Queen's ambition before it even truly began. The survival of the new empire relied completely on the outcome of this frozen theatre of war. The fire giants posed a unique threat to the Golden Light. These towering beings possessed massive physical strength, and they actively guarded an unstable source of magic. High above the clouds, they watched over the flame of ruin. This primordial fire held enough raw heat to completely consume the Erd Tree. A single spark from this chaotic source possessed the absolute capacity to burn Marika's entire vision to the ground. If the giants ever marched down from their mountain and unleashed this inferno, the ruling class would lose everything. The golden leaves would turn to ash, and the rising civilization would vanish entirely. The Queen realized a harsh truth. Her capital could never claim absolute safety while these massive defenders tended to their apocalyptic fire. The continuous existence of the giants placed a hard limit on the Empire's security. Marika deployed her first Elden Lord to solve this massive crisis. She unleashed Godfrey upon the snow with a clear directive. He needed to slaughter the Guardians and secure their sacred fire. She instructed him directly to put the giants down and confine the flame atop the mountain. The first Elden Lord directed his golden forces northward. They marched up into the brutal cold of the mountaintops of the giants. This elevated geography, buried under heavy snow, served as the ancestral homeland for a massive race. The freezing climate posed a severe challenge to the invading army, yet the troops pushed through the thick blizzards under the king's strict command. Blacksmiths working during this era left behind pieces of white rock that tell a significant story. A specific somber smithing stone discovered in these snowy peaks holds a crucial piece of history. The item confirms the massive scale of the conflict. The text states, "These minerals sharpened the blades of champions who fought at the birth of the Erd Tree." The artisans shaping these materials recognized the immense gravity of their task. They prepared heavy gear for a monumental clash that would permanently establish a new world order. The survival of Marika's kingdom rested completely on the steel they forged. Godfrey achieved absolute victory on the ice. The brutal offensive shattered the giant civilization completely. The Golden Forces decimated the local population and wiped out their ancient culture. The king's army systematically removed any capacity these beings possessed to harm the glowing tree down in the capital. The troops showed zero mercy during their ascent. The advancing soldiers carved a path of total devastation through the highest peaks. They left behind a landscape of absolute ruin. Any traveler walking through those snowy cliffs today can easily witness the aftermath of the slaughter. Colossal skeletons litter the frozen ground. Massive skulls and cracked rib cages lie buried under the drifts, marking the open graves of an entire society. The broken stones of their architecture remain scattered across the cliffsides. Countless centuries have faded into history since those golden weapons first struck flesh. Despite the long passage of time, the physical evidence of this genocide remains perfectly intact. A visitor cannot walk across the region without passing the corpse of a fallen defender. Out of a sprawling population, a single survivor escaped the massacre. One solitary fire giant remains alive today. He tends to the Forge of the Giants at the highest edge of the continent. The lonely beast stands watch over the roaring cauldron, cursed to guard the fire alone. He remains trapped on the mountain, unable to join his slaughtered kin in death. His continuous isolation serves as a lasting monument to the massive culture that Godfrey wiped from the earth. We must focus on a vital detail of this historic conquest. Queen Marika issued a highly specific command regarding the aftermath of the slaughter. She demanded that her forces seize the flame of ruin, yet she strictly forbade her generals from putting the fire out. Godfrey received orders to isolate the blazing magic atop the frozen peak and keep it burning under constant watch. A vast distance exists between containing a hazard and wiping it from existence entirely. The fate of the entire continent hinged on that exact distinction. Because the goddess spared this volatile element, the fire survived the end of the war. It smoldered for thousands of years within its heavy stone basin. This deliberate choice laid the groundwork for a massive future cataclysm. Ages after the snow settled over the giant corpses, a woman named Melina would lead a tarnished champion straight to this forgotten cauldron. She would harness those ancient sparks to ignite the Erd Tree and reduce its branches to ash. She only accomplished this feat because Marika actively kept the coals hot centuries prior. The thoughts inside the Queen's mind during this decree remain locked in the past. Those who study the ancient archives offer a few different explanations. A purely practical assessment suggests that this primal energy simply lacked a physical weakness. A fire birthed at the dawn of creation might burn with an intensity that no weapon or spell could ever quench. If this proved true, placing a permanent guard around the forge stood as the only realistic victory her army could claim. Other scholars propose a much colder motive. The Flame of Ruin stood as the solitary weapon capable of harming the glowing tree. By keeping this threat intact, the goddess secretly secured a powerful advantage. The Erd tree served as a physical anchor for a massive divine entity known as the Greater Will. If the queen ever decided to betray this unseen master, she would need a reliable tool to sever its grip on the realm. Stashing the fire in the frozen north gave her a quiet insurance policy. She held onto a world-ending trigger in case she ever needed to launch a rebellion. While we can only guess at her private motives, her outward actions stand as undeniable facts. She commanded the fire to stay lit. That single strategic decree eventually guaranteed the total burning of her own kingdom. The historical impact of this northern conquest remains absolute. The slaughter on the ice elevated the first Elden Lord to an unmatched status among his people and permanently secured the ruling class. Prior to this massive march, the young kingdom suffered from a fatal vulnerability. The massive Guardians of the Flame acted as a loaded weapon pointed directly at the capital. By crushing those defenders, the chieftain eliminated the single largest hazard to the glowing tree's supremacy. With the mountain finally silent, Marika's new era could truly take root and flourish across the continent. The goddess could finally stand before her followers and announce an epoch glistening with life, strictly because her favored warlord survived the blizzards to execute her enemies. Without his heavy axe, her ambitious vision would have failed completely. Every single site of grace that dots the landscape today owes its existence to this exact military campaign. Whenever a resurrected Tarnished follows those golden rays across the foggy fields, they are treading on soil paid for by this frozen crusade. The massive leaves casting their light over the valleys only exist safely because an army of knights shattered a rival civilization. The king bought this total security using brute force. He relied on forged iron, heavy axes, and a specialized infantry division channeling the primal crucible through their brass plating. The warlord descended the snowy cliffs, leaving behind an endless graveyard and a safely sealed cauldron. As he marched his troops back through the stone gates of Leyndell, the royal empire reached the absolute peak of its authority. No other faction possessed the numbers or the magic to challenge the throne. However, a final threat remained active within the realm. One last combatant required the chieftain's attention before true peace could settle over the land. For this concluding clash, the first Elden Lord would leave his elite forces far behind. He ordered his vanguard to stand down. He refused to bring his loyal captains or his seasoned infantry to the battlefield. He marched toward his ultimate challenger completely by himself. Up to this moment in history, the first Elden Lord operated as a supreme commander. He moved vast legions across the continent. His previous conquests relied heavily on strict logistics and overwhelming troop numbers. When he shattered the civilization of the fire giants, he utilized thousands of loyal soldiers. The Crucible captains executed complex strategies to crush the enemy lines. Kingdoms usually rise through this exact method. Rulers build their empires by throwing massive battalions at a specific obstacle until it breaks. The metal plates of the Elden Lord armor share a completely different kind of story. This same gear that outlines his sprawling military campaigns highlights a unique clash. Following his absolute triumph in the snow, the chieftain walked southward. He sought out the Stormlord for a solitary duel. He told his trusted vanguard to stay back. He left his elite infantry resting at their camp. Two supreme fighters met on an open field. They brought no banners or backup to the dirt. The clash relied purely on individual muscle and martial skill. The ruler of Leyndell matched his heavy steel against the master of the winds. The ancient archives refused to provide the specifics of this fight. Historians left behind zero records regarding the exact flow of combat. We lack any scrolls describing how the chieftain swung his axe or how his opponent fought back. The records only care about the final result. The surviving texts simply document who survived the encounter and what prize he gained from the slaughter. Hoarah proved his superiority and crushed his rival. By killing this final challenger, the king earned the absolute right to rule Stormvale Castle. This colossal fortress guards the main entrance to the region of Limgrave. It stands as a towering choke point for anyone travelling through the southern cliffs. The stronghold draws its entire cultural identity directly from this historic execution. Its walls carry the memory of the defeated ruler. The architecture remains standing today purely as a monument to Godfrey's physical supremacy. The chieftain stared down his ultimate rival, struck a lethal blow, and permanently claimed his seat of power. Anyone travelling north from the southern shores will eventually stand in the shadow of Stormvale Castle. This towering fortress dominates the main entrance into Limgrave. The stronghold sits high upon a steep cliff, watching over the coastal valleys with an ancient authority. Wanderers passing through its heavy gates usually focus entirely on surviving the hostile soldiers stationed inside. However, the imposing architecture tells a much deeper story. The entire castle functions as a lasting trophy commemorating that solitary duel. Every carved block of stone serves as absolute proof of Godfrey's lethality when he fought completely unsupported. He lacked any royal guards to cover his blind spots, yet he still walked away with a monumental victory. This specific clash occupies a completely unique chapter in his long history of violence. When the chieftain faced the northern giants, he deployed a massive army to wipe out their entire culture. When an individual challenger claimed the southern skies, the first Elden Lord simply readied his axe and marched out alone. This clear contrast illustrates his total mastery of combat. The king possessed the tactical brilliance to direct legions of infantry through brutal blizzards. He also retained the raw physical might to personally execute a rival that demanded his direct intervention. He operated flawlessly as a commanding general, and he functioned just as effectively as a lone executioner. The king's thirst for conquest did not end with the mountain blizzards or the howling winds of Limgrave. His military march reached far past those two famous victories. During the absolute infancy of the empire, the surrounding landscape completely rejected Marika's vision. Every living faction existing across the continent fought aggressively against the glowing tree. Scaled dragons ruled the skies. Ancient beastmen roamed the wilderness. Countless creatures drew their vitality directly from the crucible. This chaotic wellspring represented the original form of biology. It thrived long before the new religion arrived to enforce strict rules on nature. The rising kingdom needed to crush all of these older groups. Only through complete subjugation could the ruling class declare total supremacy over the soil. The first Elden Lord swung his axe personally to settle many of these disputes. In other regions, he simply deployed his massive legions to handle the slaughter. He oversaw countless simultaneous offensives across the map. He directed his generals to sweep through foreign territories and execute any resisting leaders. His elite infantry provides the clearest proof of this brutal strategy. The famed Crucible Knights marched at the front of these attacks. These loyal soldiers fueled their strikes using the exact same primal magic their enemies possessed. They channeled the wild energy of the ancient world straight into their brass plates. By fielding an entire unit of troops empowered by this magic, the chieftain engaged in a calculated irony. He sent warriors steeped in the old traditions to butcher factions loyal to those exact roots. He harnessed the native strength of the lands he wanted to steal and turned it directly against the original inhabitants. The historical makeup of his vanguard reveals this ruthless tactic plainly. Those who study the oldest ruins often debate the specific targets of these early crusades. Many learned scholars believe the feral beastmen of Farum Azula suffered heavily under Godfrey's advancing forces. These creatures lived in a crumbling domain and served as pure extensions of that older era. The beastmen channeled the chaotic essence of early life. Slaughtering these tribes aligns perfectly with the Queen's larger ambition. Marika wanted to violently erase the blended state of biology that defined the past. She intended to replace that untamed freedom with her highly structured society. While the royal archives lack the exact casualty lists of this specific invasion, the physical evidence remains compelling. The existence of the king's primordial infantry heavily supports this historical conclusion. The Empire clearly weaponized the Old World to tear the Old World apart. Take a moment to view the absolute sheer scale of this total subjugation. The massive guardians of the flame lay dead in the northern snow. The solitary master of the southern winds collapsed under a single lethal strike. Airborne dragons crashed to the earth and surrendered their skies. Feral beastmen and ancient tribes tied to the primordial crucible bowed their heads to a new king. Throughout this sprawling shift in power, the heavy infantry of the Crucible Knights marched across every single active front. Any sovereign faction that thrived before the glowing tree took root faced a blunt choice. They either bled out in the dirt or dropped to their knees in absolute submission to Marika's reigning enforcer. A wanderer traveling across the continent today navigates a landscape forged entirely by these specific crusades. The distinct political borders dividing the regions originate from his military lines. The placement of towering stone castles and the existence of shattered ruins directly reflect the path of his advancing armies. Every surviving group of people, whether they serve the Golden Capital loyally or plot secret rebellions in the shadows, lives within a reality dictated by Godfrey's wrath. The first Elden Lord served as a brutal creator. He shaped the exact physical and cultural structure of the new era using overwhelming physical force. He carved out the foundation of an entire civilization using the heavy blade of his axe as his primary tool. He hacked away the old society to make room for the new one. Eventually, his relentless slaughter yielded a permanent result. The chieftain struck down his final capable opponent, and the battlefield suddenly grew completely quiet. The endless era of conflict settled into a deep, unbroken peace across the lands. This absolute triumph carried a fatal consequence. The complete lack of war would soon strip the warlord of his crown, his grace, and his home. The silence of the realm guaranteed his total ruin. Queen Marika and Godfrey I, Elden Lord, brought 3 children into the world. To truly grasp the cold reality hiding behind the glowing leaves of the capital, one must examine the fates of these royal offspring. The brutal machinery of the new empire spared no one, The exact kingdom Godfrey carved out with his heavy axe eventually chewed up his own flesh and blood. Godwyn the Golden arrived first. The eldest prince possessed bright blonde hair and commanded absolute adoration from the citizens of Leyndell. By all historical accounts, he served as the flawless physical avatar for everything the reigning religion preached. Anyone trying to engineer an ideal successor to inherit the throne from such legendary parents would point directly at him. He stood tall as a highly capable combatant who proved his martial strength time and time again on the front lines. He also held a rare quality that completely eluded his savage father. The prince carried genuine nobility within his heart. He possessed a vast capacity for mercy. The young royal inherently understood a vital lesson regarding warfare. A conqueror simply did not have to slaughter every beaten opponent lying in the dirt. A massive conflict against the scaled rulers of the sky cemented his historical legacy forever. A colossal beast named Gransax managed to shatter the stone walls protecting the capital. Following this catastrophic breach, Godwyn marched outside the city gates to duel another massive threat. He engaged the fearsome Fortisax in a solitary clash of strength. The prince struck hard and secured a total victory. He stood over the wounded creature with a lethal strike prepared. Instead of driving his blade down into the beast's neck, the heir chose a different path entirely. He offered his open hand to the defeated monster. The royal combatant established a genuine bond of friendship with his former target. This singular display of compassion brought the entire aerial conflict to an immediate halt. His decision birthed a completely new movement within the city walls, known as the Ancient Dragon Cult. The parchment attached to the lightning spear incantation documents this exact sequence of events. The text confirms the prince bested Fortisax in combat before earning his loyalty, leading directly to the establishment of the capital's lightning-worshipping faction. Imagine the heavy thoughts racing through the chieftain's mind as he watched this unfold. For decades, the first Elden Lord forced himself to choke down his endless thirst for slaughter. He surrendered his back to a phantom lion simply to maintain a civilized appearance inside the throne room. Now, this exhausted general stood back and observed his eldest son walk away from a bloody crater, having transformed a lethal adversary into a loyal companion using pure grace. Godwyn represented far more than a simple heir to the crown. The Golden Prince served as living, breathing proof that the daily torture of Hoaraloo's physical restraint finally yielded a pure result. The beastly king had successfully fathered a man worth saving. Following the Golden Prince, the Queen gave birth to twin boys. Morgott and Mohg arrived, bearing a heavy affliction. The clerics of the ruling religion quickly labelled these infants as omens. Under the strict laws of the capital, society viewed this condition as a physical manifestation of tainted blood. Knotted horns grew directly from the babies' skulls. Their bodies bore distinct biological markers of the ancient crucible. This chaotic force represented the exact untamed state of biology that ruled the lands before Marika enforced her pristine laws on nature. The sheer irony of this birth hit with brutal force. The first Elden Lord spent his entire military career slaughtering factions tied to this specific magic. He commanded his elite brass-armored infantry to channel that exact same energy to win his early wars. Now, after decades of violently burying the old world, the chieftain stared down at two sons infected with that identical primal essence. the wild magic he fought so hard to erase from the continent had somehow taken root deep inside his own royal bloodline. When a peasant family in the lower city birthed an omen child, the Golden Society acted with extreme cruelty. The religious doctrine demanded an immediate, violent removal of the animal growths. Royal surgeons would cut the thick bone away from the infant's head. The bloody procedure almost always resulted in a quick death. The Empire utilized this lethal surgery to constantly cleanse the population of anyone carrying the ancient taint. The rules changed entirely when this affliction struck the absolute highest tier of nobility. A keepsake known as the Regal Omen Bairn documents this hidden exception plainly. The artifact confirms that children born of royal flesh bypassed the surgeon's knife. The ruling class refused to amputate the horns of a prince. The Empire devised a completely different punishment for the twins. Palace guards carried the royal infants deep below the city streets. They locked the boys inside the subterranean shunning grounds, a sprawling, damp prison built far beneath Lanedale's bright avenues. Morgott and Moog faced a permanent sentence of absolute darkness behind heavy iron grates. The ruling priests orchestrated this massive cover-up to protect their perfect image. If the citizens discovered the truth, the clerics would face a massive theological crisis. The public would demand to know how a divine goddess and her legendary warlord produced offspring completely rejected by their own faith. The strict religious framework simply lacked the capacity to explain such a massive failure in the divine bloodline. The leaders solved this problem by erasing the twins from history completely. They buried the boys alive in the sewers and abandoned them in the muck. The kingdom forced the two brothers to mature in total isolation, leaving them alone to navigate the reality of their cursed existence in the dark. Growing up, surrounded by the damp walls of the underground sewers, Morgott eventually made a firm decision regarding his destiny. He refused to accept the mutant identity his body forced upon him. The young prince actively suppressed his physical deformities. He locked away the tainted blood running through his veins, completely refusing to tap into its power. Instead of harboring hatred for his captors, he swore a lifelong oath to defend the Erd Tree. This choice carried a heavy irony. The towering tree stood as the central pillar of the exact religious government that had ordered his banishment. The golden authorities threw him into a sunless pit as an infant, yet he willingly transformed himself into their most dedicated soldier. The artifact holding his soul plainly documents his lonely existence. Morgott appointed himself as the absolute shield for the capital city, stepping into a harsh role no one asked him to fill. The text on his remembrance describes his motivation perfectly. It says he loved it without receiving love in return, for he had never been loved, and he loved it anyway. He spent his adulthood guarding the high walls and fighting off endless threats. He received absolutely zero gratitude from the citizens he kept alive. The residents living comfortably above ground never even knew he existed. His actions reveal a warrior completely lacking inner peace. He poured his entire being into worshipping an authority that viewed his birth as a disgusting mistake. He maintained this stubborn loyalty through constant conflicts and centuries of isolation. When invaders known as the Tarnished eventually marched up the stone steps to claim the Erd Tree, Morgott planted his feet firmly in their path. He fought these challengers with vicious intensity until his body finally broke. He bled to death on the cold ground, sacrificing his life for an empire that had only ever provided him with heavy chains and a locked cell. Mohg chose a completely opposite path. While sitting in the cold shadows, entirely cut off from the shining grace of the Erd Tree, he discovered a different kind of salvation. He reached into the dark and made contact with an entity known as the Formless Mother. This foreign deity answered the young prince in his absolute isolation. She touched the tainted blood pooling inside his veins and set it on fire with her own strange magic. Mohg felt zero shame about his physical form. He gladly accepted his jagged horns and raw strength. He used his banishment as a solid foundation for his own empire. Gathering followers who also lived outside the law, he carved out a sovereign territory deep beneath the surface. He constructed a massive underground domain called Mohgwyn Palace, establishing a royal dynasty entirely independent of Queen Marika and her golden rules. We can clearly see the massive divide between the siblings by examining his great rune. The text tied to this artifact lays out their split history directly. The two runes are naturally similar, it says, because the twins share a bloodline. But Mohg's is soaked in a cursed energy drawn from his deep devotion to the wretched place he was born into, far below the earth. These twin boys started out on exactly the same footing. They shared a mother, a locked cage, and an isolated childhood. Morgott wasted his entire existence seeking validation from a system that only viewed him as garbage. Mohg simply stopped asking for their approval and crowned himself king of his own bloody domain instead. Sometimes, a conclusion arrives without any loud tragedy. Kings frequently lose their crowns on hostile battlefields. Royal dynasties routinely collapse due to sudden political betrayals. Yet a ruler can also reach an ending simply by running out of land to conquer. He stands entirely alone at the peak of his power, looking out over a fully subdued continent, only to find the guiding energy quietly abandoning his body. This exact quiet finish happened to the first Elden Lord. Across the lands between, grace operates as a completely literal force. It exists as a physical substance anyone can observe. For those blessed by the Erd Tree, this power pools directly inside their pupils, giving them a bright gaze. It also physically manifests across the soil as warm pools of light. These bright clearings offer a safe place to rest and actively point chosen individuals toward their next objective. Possessing this glow proves that the greater will claims you as a useful tool. It serves as an official stamp of approval from a higher authority, guaranteeing that your actions serve a deliberate design. As long as a person holds that shine, they walk with absolute certainty. Losing this blessing strips away all direction completely. A person abandoned by this light becomes tarnished. Their physical body survives, yet their internal fire completely dies out. They wander the dirt paths blindly, lacking any higher objective to push them forward. Their eyes turn dull and grey. The heavy silence replacing the divine guidance leaves them completely detached from the Erd Tree's authority. Eventually, the golden hue drained entirely from Godfrey's face. His situation differs entirely from other exiled figures in our history. The warlord never committed treason, he avoided breaking his vows, and he steered clear of committing any crime against Queen Marika's holy laws. He suffered this loss for a completely unexpected reason. He simply won every single battle. He crushed his final opponent and secured the last inch of hostile territory. Once he planted the Golden Order's flag over the furthest edges of the map, his usefulness evaporated. The ruling power brought him in to wage war. Since peace had finally settled across the newly unified kingdom, the Greater Will had 0 instructions left to give him. His original duty reached its absolute limit, causing his connection to the Holy Tree to snap. We can read about this precise transition on the heavy chest piece he wore into combat. The metal plates, known as the Elden Lord armor, document the event with blunt honesty. The inscription reads, "There came a moment when his last worthy enemy fell, and it was then that the hue of Lord Godfrey's eyes faded." The historical record offers 0 embellishment. No lightning struck the castle walls, and no dramatic argument erupted in the throne room. A supreme commander simply looked around a quiet battlefield, realized his violent work was complete, and watched his holy light vanish into the air. Following the sudden vanishing of his inner light, Queen Marika stepped forward to make his transition official. She moved decisively to cast out the general who had secured her empire. She gathered Godfrey and his massive army of seasoned soldiers to deliver a blunt royal decree. Ancient records maintained inside the stone ruins of the Third Church of Marika capture her exact speech from the day of their banishment. She stood before the silent crowd and formally stripped away every remaining trace of their blessing. She announced clearly that since their eyes now lacked the holy shine, they faced immediate expulsion from the lands between. Her strict commands forced the entire military force to pack their weapons and abandon the continent completely. They had to cross the foggy oceans and settle in hostile, unknown territories. Marika instructed them to continue fighting across these distant shores. They would struggle to survive out there, waging continuous campaigns until they ultimately passed from the world. Anyone listening to these instructions would view the event as a harsh punishment. The decree comes across as a totally cold dismissal. It sounds exactly like an unfeeling monarch discarding a broken shield after finishing a long conflict. On a superficial level, Marika simply tossed her own husband and his loyal veterans aside because raw violence held absolutely 0 value during an era of peace. Yet the Queen harbored a highly secretive plan. She delivered a second, private message to her departing troops. We can find this crucial follow-up speech recorded safely inside the Queen's bedchamber, located within the highest levels of the royal palace. These additional instructions completely shift the reality of the situation. Marika made an astonishing promise to the banished army. She swore that, after their passing, she would give back what she once claimed. She ordered them to return to the lands between, wage war, and take hold of the Elden Ring. She explicitly commanded them to grow strong in the face of passing from the world. These are her words to the warriors of her lord, Lord Godfrey. By doing so, she secretly planted the seeds for a massive future invasion long before her men ever walked out of the capital. That hidden directive reveals a highly deliberate strategy. Queen Marika refused to simply discard a loyal commander who had completed his objective. Instead, she started constructing a massive weapon for the future. The banishment functioned strictly as a brutal training ground. She forced the king and his seasoned troops to march into unknown territories and wage endless campaigns against foreign enemies. They would fight, bleed, and eventually die in distant places. Yet death would fail to hold them permanently. Through pure, stubborn willpower and a lingering thread of their former blessing, these soldiers would continuously rise from the dirt. Every single cycle of dying and returning to life would physically harden their bodies and sharpen their combat instincts. They would evolve into an elite military force, waiting patiently for the exact moment the Erd Tree finally summoned them back. The creation of the Tarnished happened completely by design. The day the first Elden Lord walked out of the capital marked the exact start of this massive military project. Historians constantly debate exactly when the Queen finalized this grand scheme. We lack clear records showing if she planned this betrayal on the specific day she first met the chieftain. Many scholars studying the ancient texts believe she orchestrated this entire sequence from the beginning. According to these accounts, she always viewed her husband as a raw resource required to forge the Tarnished army. His holy blessing, his royal title, and his decades of bloody conquest all served this single hidden objective. When analyzing her private speech, specifically her promise about giving back what she once claimed after their passing, the words point strongly toward a heavily calculated plot. Still, no physical document proves exactly when she made her choice, leaving scholars to argue over her true timeline.
Another historical perspective suggests a highly practical motive for removing the king. The banishment allowed the queen to clear a massive roadblock standing directly in her path. She had quietly begun plotting against the greater will itself. The first Elden Lord represented the strongest and most aggressively loyal champion the Empire possessed. He had dedicated his entire adult life to enforcing her holy laws with his heavy axe. If Marika had already started planning to smash the Elden Ring, her own husband posed the biggest physical threat to her rebellion. His absolute devotion to the established authority meant he would likely strike down anyone attempting to destroy it, including his own wife. By sending him across the ocean, she accomplished two massive goals simultaneously. She successfully incubated her Tarnished army in a distant land, and she permanently removed the only warrior capable of stopping her treason. This sequence of events perfectly explains the chaos that swallowed the continent shortly after his departure. Regardless of her hidden motives, the physical facts remain entirely clear. The Queen permanently drained the holy light from her husband's eyes and forced him out of the lands between. The man had conquered every single enemy the Empire pointed him toward. His continuous military campaigns completely reshaped the borders of the continent. He spent decades carrying a massive beast on his back, restricting his own violent nature merely to serve his ruler smoothly. Now, she handed him a decree of exile as his final military assignment. He accepted this command without hesitation. Obedience defined his entire existence. The disgraced monarch gathered his troops. He led them directly into the Sea of Fog and officially initiated the Long March. He absolutely refused to undertake this grueling journey by himself. Every veteran soldier who had marched beside him into the freezing mountains to slaughter giants stood ready. The elite fighters who survived the brutal siege against the Stormlord packed their gear. The entire army that had aggressively transformed a small golden cult into the absolute authority of the realm followed their commander out the gates. The moment the Queen severed her husband's connection to the Erd Tree, that exact same blindness struck his loyal battalions. The bright shine vanished from thousands of eyes simultaneously. When the king stepped onto the ships to leave the continent forever, his loyal soldiers marched right onto the wooden decks beside him. A heavy maritime relic known as the Rusty Anchor contains a specific memory of this massive exodus. The rusted iron artifact tells a quiet story about the scale of the migration. When the disgraced army left the continent, they packed onto massive wooden fleets to cross the ocean. According to the historical record, exactly one empty boat remained sitting on the sandy shore. Thousands of veteran soldiers boarded the ships, leaving absolutely no one behind to man that final vessel. Every single fighter who bled for the Empire chose to follow their warlord into the unknown, rather than stay behind in a peaceful kingdom. They abandoned their homes together as a unified force. These loyal troops became the inaugural generation of a brand new faction that would eventually scatter across foreign lands. Ancient scholars call these outcasts the Tarnished. In older dialects, the specific word used to describe them translates directly as faded people. The label describes their physical condition perfectly. They avoided curses, and they never suffered a true defeat. Instead, the bright light inside their pupils simply burned out and left dull colours behind. Yet this blindness to holy guidance left them completely capable of violence. A faded warrior still possessed a sharp mind, thick muscles, and lethal instincts. They remained incredibly dangerous on any battlefield. This stark reality formed the basic foundation for every single exile wandering outside the borders of the continent. The entire phenomenon started the moment Godfrey's battalions stepped off the beaches and sailed into the fog. Carrying this faded status involved two primary conditions. First, the individual suffered a total separation from the Erd Tree. They could no longer feel the warmth of the golden branches or follow a divinely chosen path. The second condition acted as a heavy anchor to the physical world. A tarnished person entirely lost the ability to stay dead. Whenever a sword pierced their chest or magic burned their skin, they refused to pass into the afterlife permanently. Some stubborn, lingering energy forcefully pulled their souls back into their bodies. An outcast might fall violently in the mud, only to stand up again hours later. With every single brutal death, the fighter returned slightly smarter and noticeably stronger. The pain of dying taught them exactly how to survive longer during the next skirmish. Any lone warrior who eventually marches back to the continent to claim the throne operates entirely under this ancient design. When a nameless champion dies endlessly against a towering warlord, they wake up next to a glowing pool of light every single time. They use their repeated failures to study their enemies' movements. They grow highly dangerous precisely because they absorb harsh lessons from their own slaughter. This cycle of endless resurrection and adaptation operates as a literal law of the universe, rather than a mere legend. Queen Marika engineered the exile specifically to create this immortal, hardening process. Any champion who pushes through impossible odds today simply executes the exact military strategy she launched ages ago. After the warlord's ships disappeared into the mist, the Queen quickly moved to fill her empty throne. She elevated a champion named Radagon to act as her second royal husband. The actual truth behind this marriage remains deeply hidden from the common citizens. Radagon lacked an independent origin. He actually existed as Marika's own alternate self, a masculine half she carried directly inside her own flesh. She simply gave this internal entity a physical body and crowned him king. By marrying her own counterpart, the Queen launched a brand new royal family. This fresh bloodline stood entirely separate from the mighty heirs her first husband had fathered. The offspring born from this bizarre union would eventually ignite massive conflicts across the continent. Yet those specific tragedies belong to a separate chapter of history entirely. The banished warlord's departure permanently shaped the future of the world. The existence of the faded warriors stems directly from his expulsion. Their strange ability to die and violently wake up again happened purely by the Queen's design. Any lone fighter who eventually crosses the ocean to claim the empty throne owes their strength to this exact ancient event. Every painful death, every bloody victory, and every slow gain in combat skill traces back to the morning a monarch stole the holy light from her commander's vision. She pushed him into the ocean with a firm promise tied to his back. She vowed to summon his descendants home when the era demanded it. She knew the continent would eventually require the sheer brutality only an immortal outcast could deliver. However, long before that massive recall occurred, the former king faced decades of survival in foreign territories. He prepared to leave his royal privileges behind completely. Outside the borders of the known world, the Holy Tree held zero authority. No shining branches filled the sky, and no golden priests dictated local laws. The exiled army found only rough dirt, wild beasts, and hostile foreigners willing to defend their territory. A disgraced chieftain marched at the front of a massive, blinded military force. Historians simply call this grueling era the Long March. Surviving texts provide zero accurate maps of their exact route. We lack a neat list of the foreign castles they burned or the specific armies they crushed. The ancient scrolls only reveal a continuous, brutal campaign spanning multiple continents. The former king drove his loyal veterans forward through uncharted wilderness, completely abandoning the comfortable lives they once enjoyed. These men and women refused to act like frightened refugees. They showed no interest in farming crops or building quiet villages in a peaceful valley. They knew only how to wage war, so they simply kept drawing their weapons. A specific relic called the Axe Talisman captures the brutal culture of this era. The metal carving states clearly, "The Lord who led the Long March bore an axe." It continues by adding that his loyal warriors honored him by wielding axes of their own. This fighting style mirrored the harsh traditions of his original homeland. The exact methods he used to dominate his native territory long before wearing a golden crown now completely defined his exiled army. A massive commander wielding a heavy blade led thousands of fighters carrying similar weapons. They pushed deep into strange landscapes, relying strictly on brute force to solve every single problem they encountered. Deep into this endless campaign, during a nameless clash against unknown enemies, the king's signature weapon finally shattered. The physical description attached to the Axe of Godfrey confirms this event directly. It explains that the weapon was broken in battle while he led the Tarnished during the Long March. The historical record provides crucial context about the man holding the ruined handle. The text explains that the axe was symbolic of his vow to conduct himself as a lord. It states that the weapon became an emblem of the golden lineage and was wielded with the firm belief that a crown was warranted with strength. The most important detail is his reaction to the damage. He flatly refused to replace it. A warlord possessing thousands of loyal soldiers could easily demand a freshly forged blade from any blacksmith. Instead, he chose to swing the cracked iron. He gripped the ruined metal as visual proof of the intense combat that finally cracked it. He never tried to hide the fractured steel as some kind of embarrassment. Carrying the ruined weapon functioned as a loud, daily statement. It proved he intended to keep the promise he made back in the capital. The shattered blade showed his soldiers that his royal vow remained completely intact, even while dragging his boots through foreign mud. He lacked a stone throne, he lacked a glowing holy tree, and his eyes held zero divine light. Yet he maintained his strict discipline. He operated under the rigid rule that a crown was warranted with strength. He proved this truth in the capital, and he proved it again in the dirtiest, most difficult environments possible. The Empire stripped him of his royal rank and threw him into uncharted wilderness. His primary weapon barely functioned. Despite all these hardships, he successfully maintained the tight balance between acting as a noble leader and unleashing the ruthless killer buried inside his chest. The giant lion named Sarosh stayed firmly attached to his shoulders through every single skirmish. The beast kept its claws dug in, ensuring the physical restraint held firm. The heavy vow survived the ocean crossing. Even with the Golden Empire completely out of sight, he refused to slip back into mindless savagery. For the sake of the loyal troops marching through the dirt beside him, the commander continued to conduct himself entirely as a lord. Eventually, this endless military campaign reached a clear finish line. The ancient records document exactly what occurred on that final day. When the long march of the Tarnished came to its conclusion, Godfrey divested himself of kingship. He did not misplace his crown, and no usurper stole it from his head. He discarded his royal status completely on his own terms. He threw away the name Godfrey, along with every single obligation attached to it. The commander gladly stepped back into his original identity. He stood in the dirt simply as Hoarah-Lu, chieftain of the Badlands. The exiled leader and his giant lion companion, Sarosh, travelled back to his native territory. They settled down comfortably in that harsh environment. He left behind the shining armour and the strict politics of the capital city forever. He spent his remaining years fighting in local skirmishes, living plainly until his physical body finally failed. He crossed into death far away from glowing trees and stone throne rooms. He expired entirely outside the authority of any religious framework. The strongest military general the continent ever witnessed spent his final moments doing exactly what he always enjoyed most. He lived as a brute fighter in the exact dirt where he was born. We can find silent proof of this personal transformation by examining the golden memory left behind after his soul departs. Inside the Erdtree's history, fallen champions leave behind crystallized essence. Almost every other soul memory honors a high political rank. we see the remembrance of the grafted, the remembrance of the Star Scourge, and the remembrance of the Omen King. These artifacts celebrate the specific royal title the person achieved during their life. Yet, the memory containing this chieftain's spirit carries a totally different inscription. The glowing crest simply reads, "Remembrance of Hora Lu." It ignores his status as First Elden Lord completely. It ignores the noble name Queen Marika gave him. It uses the fierce name he carried before he ever bent his knee to a foreign deity. This choice of words holds massive weight. It reveals which identity actually mattered to the man's core soul. The golden armor functioned strictly as a heavy disguise. He wore that kingly mask loyally for decades to accomplish a specific job for his wife. Once he finished the task and concluded his grueling march, he dropped the disguise permanently. He passed into the darkness entirely as a native warrior from the Badlands. Centuries would pass before a strange force suddenly commanded him to wake up. While the aging chieftain fought his final battles across the ocean, his former empire faced an unstoppable collapse. The age of the Erd Tree stood on the edge of ruin. A quiet robbery sparked this massive disaster. A shadow beast named Malekith, the Black Blade, guarded the Rune of Death. This powerful law of nature controlled exactly how living creatures left the physical world. Under Queen Marika's strict system, permanent death remained completely locked away from her royal family. Common people still died, yet the absolute destruction offered by the Rune of Death sat safely hidden in a vault. The Queen secured this dangerous law to keep her golden dynasty totally invincible. Then, an intruder breached the vault and claimed a shard of that forbidden power. Rani the Witch, a Carian Empyrean, executed this daring heist. The ruling authorities had marked her as a prime candidate to eventually inherit absolute control over the realm. She harbored intense personal reasons to escape this forced destiny. Her private rebellion completely shattered the safety of the ruling family. She stole a fragment of the lethal rune right out from under Malekith's nose. Rani took this stolen fragment and performed something the historical texts only refer to as a fearsome rite. Through this dark magic, she forged a series of completely lethal weapons. She created the Black Knives. These daggers possessed the exact power necessary to murder an immortal being. They carried the raw energy of permanent destruction. Rani took the exact rule Marika locked away to protect the Empire and weaponized it against her own relatives. The witch openly admits to this entire crime. If asked, she accepts complete responsibility without a single ounce of hesitation. She proudly details what she stole, how she altered the fragment, and confirms she made the decision entirely on her own. The killers wielding these newly forged daggers belonged to a specific group. They were Numen women, hailing from the exact same ancient bloodline as Queen Marika. Under the cover of a freezing fog, these cloaked figures slipped into the capital city. They chose Godwyn the Golden as their primary target. The assassins aimed their weapons directly at the first Elden Lord's eldest son. This golden-haired prince had previously halted a massive dragon invasion simply by showing compassion. He possessed enough nobility to spare a beaten rival, birthing a massive religious movement through one simple gesture of peace. To the citizens of the Empire, he represented the absolute peak of their civilization. The Numen strikers made sure he fell before anyone else. A scholar named Sorcerer Rogier dedicated huge amounts of time to investigating this specific crime. He summarizes the tragedy perfectly, noting the historical weight of the attack. "Someone stole a fragment of the rune of death," he says, "and on a bitter night took the life of Godwyn the Golden." That was the first recorded passing of a demigod in all of history. This unprecedented murder functioned as the spark that eventually burned the entire continent to the ground. However, the young prince did not simply bleed out and pass away cleanly. The magic inside the black knives operated in a highly specific manner. The blades sliced through his existence, severing his soul entirely while leaving his physical flesh intact. The strike permanently deleted his consciousness. All his compassion, his royal bearing, and his bright personality vanished completely. Yet, his heart kept beating in a distorted manner. His hollow shell survived in a stagnant condition, caught permanently between living and dying. The ruling priests moved his unresponsive frame deep underground, burying him near the massive roots of the Erd tree beneath Lanedale. This placement caused a severe biological disaster. Because his flesh refused to rot naturally, a foul plague called deathroot started growing from his infected tissue. This dark weed aggressively chewed through the wooden foundations of the capital. The toxic vines crawled outward from his resting place, infecting the soil across the land. The noble son who once served as the flawless poster boy for the Empire now functioned as a biological weapon, slowly choking the holy tree from below. The former king missed this entire catastrophe. By the time the assassins drew their daggers, Godfrey had already sailed across the ocean. He was either pushing through the final stages of the Long March, or already sitting comfortably in the Badlands. The exiled general remained completely unaware of the tragedy. He lacked any method to receive news from the capital. He never got the opportunity to stand proudly beside his eldest boy, or guide him through adulthood. Before the old warlord could ever dream of returning home, his brightest child was destroyed. All of the general's military conquests ultimately produced a highly toxic society. He spent his youth violently conquering the map to build an empire, yet the resulting government turned out incredibly fragile. The strict laws he helped enforce shoved 2 of his infants into a sunless sewer simply because they possessed horns. The grand political system cracked completely the moment a single thief breached a vault. The Empire rewarded his most honorable son with a twisted mutilation rather than a clean death. Godwyn died without ever looking upon his father's face a second time. The Golden Prince fell inside the exact same city his father had aggressively fortified, murdered by women sharing his own mother's blood. The hidden motives driving this betrayal remained completely buried for generations. The situation in the lands between had deteriorated rapidly, and true chaos was just arriving. Following the murder of the Golden Prince, the entire realm froze in shock. The assassins had accomplished something once thought impossible. They had killed a divine being and left behind a wound that could not be undone. The safety Marika promised her people suddenly seemed fragile. Overcome by the loss, she raised her stone hammer and brought it down upon the Elden Ring. With that act, the foundation of the Golden Order shattered. Radagon tried desperately to mend the broken ring, but his efforts failed. In response to Marika's betrayal, the Greater Will imprisoned her within the Erd tree. The broken shards of the Elden Ring then fell into the hands of her surviving children. These fragments carried immense power, and the demigods who claimed them were consumed by ambition. Each believed they could seize the throne and impose their own order upon the lands between. That struggle became known as the Shattering. Armies clashed across every region, but no side emerged victorious. The Elden Ring had been broken. Marika had disappeared. Godwyn had fallen on the Night of the Black Knives.
The demigods claimed the great runes, and their newfound power drove them into war. And from that war, no lord arose.
The conflict dragged on without a clear victor. The great powers of the lands between simply wore one another down. Grace faded, and the order Godfrey had helped build collapsed with it. But Marika had prepared for this possibility long before. When she banished Godfrey and his warriors from the lands between, she promised that one day their grace would be returned. They would fight, die, and grow stronger in distant lands until the time came for them to return. That time had finally arrived. Grace once again appeared to the Tarnished beyond the lands between. Among those called back were Hoarah, chieftain of the Badlands, Goldmask, Fear, the deathbed companion, the Dung-Eater, Sir Gideon Ofnir, the All-Knowing, and one other Tarnished, whose journey would eventually decide the fate of the Elden Ring. Hoarah rose once more. He had no throne now, and no kingdom. He carried the battered axe that had followed him through exile, while Sarosh remained bound to his back. After years beyond the lands between, the former king began the journey home. He returned to answer the question left unresolved by the Shattering. Who was strong enough to claim the empty throne? Long before the Tarnished faces Godfrey himself, Leyndell presents an image of the first Elden Lord as he once was. A golden shade of Godfrey guards the path leading toward the Erdtree. This figure is not the living king, but an echo of his former self. It preserves the image of Godfrey during the height of his reign. The shade carries an unbroken axe. He still wears the crown. Sarosh remains firmly upon his back. Everything about the figure represents Godfrey before his exile, when he still stood as Marika's champion and the first Elden Lord. Defeating the shade grants no remembrance. It is only a guardian left behind in the capital. The real Godfrey waits much later. When Godfrey finally returns to Leyndell, he finds the city in ruins. Ash covers the streets. The Erdtree burns overhead. The empire he helped create has fallen apart. At the center of the capital, Godfrey kneels beside the fading body of Morgott. The kingdom had hidden Morgott beneath the city for much of his life because of his omen blood. Despite that rejection, he devoted himself entirely to protecting Leyndell. Godfrey returns after years of exile, only to find his son dying before the throne. He speaks gently to him. For perhaps the first time, Morgott is acknowledged not as an omen, not as the veiled monarch, but simply as his son. Then Godfrey rises and turns toward the Tarnished. He notices that Grace now points toward his opponent. He recognizes another warrior who had once been spurned by the grace of gold, just as he had been. Then he announces himself, Godfrey, the first Elden Lord. He fights with the discipline expected of that title. His movements are deliberate. His axe swings are controlled. His stomps tear through the ground with overwhelming force. This is not simply a brute swinging a weapon. Godfrey fights like a warrior who spent a lifetime mastering violence and then learned how to restrain it. Even in victory, he shows respect toward a worthy opponent. But eventually, that restraint reaches its limit. Godfrey reaches behind his head and takes hold of Sarosh. For an entire age, the lion had restrained the bloodlust of Hoarah and allowed him to conduct himself as a lord. Godfrey looks toward his companion and says, I have given thee courtesy enough. Then he kills Sarosh and ends the pact that had defined his life as Elden Lord. His axe falls to the ground, his posture changes, the measured movements of Godfrey disappear, and he speaks the name he carried long before the crown, Hoarah. What follows is something entirely different. He abandons his weapon and fights with his bare hands. He tears into the earth, launches himself through the air, grabs his opponent by the throat, and relies on raw physical strength rather than the discipline of a king. The restraint Marika demanded from him is gone. This is the warrior who ruled the Badlands before he ever became a lord. And underneath everything else, his belief has never changed. If he defeats the Tarnished, he declares, "A crown is warranted with strength." That principle defined Hoarah before he became Godfrey, and it remains with him until the end. When he is finally defeated, he does not protest. He acknowledges the Tarnished's strength. A stronger warrior has proven worthy of the throne, and for Hoarah, that is enough. He dies according to the same rule by which he lived. The true cost of Godfrey's age can also be seen through the fate of his children. Godwyn, once celebrated as the Golden Heir, was murdered during the Night of the Black Knives. But his death was only the beginning. What happened to Godwyn afterward, and the effect it would have on death itself throughout the lands between, is a much larger story. We'll return to it in detail in another telling. Morgott spent most of his life hiding the very blood he was born with. He remained loyal to the Golden Order, even though that same order regarded him as cursed. When he finally dies, the omen traits he suppressed become one of the clearest symbols of the life he spent denying himself. Mohg took the opposite path. Rather than reject his cursed blood, he embraced it and built a dynasty of his own beneath the lands between. Even then, his ambitions ended in exploitation. After his death, Miquella used Mohg's remains as the vessel through which Radahn would return. Neither brother escaped the forces that shaped their lives. None of Godfrey's children found anything resembling peace. A trace of his lineage survives through Nepheli Loux. She carries the Loux name, fights with axes, and follows the same warrior tradition associated with Hoarah. Eventually, she takes control of Stormvale Castle, ruling the same fortress tied to the legacy of Godfrey's conquests. She can even be summoned in Leyndell to fight alongside the Tarnished against Godfrey himself. The Land of Shadow reveals another layer of Godfrey's story. Long before the Golden Order reached its height, the Hornsent civilization practiced traditions centered around horns, beasts, and divine invocation. Their elite warriors could call upon the spirits of powerful beasts through ritual. Marika would have been familiar with these practices during her rise to power. Sarosha's role beside Godfrey echoes this same idea. A beast spiritually bound to a warrior, influencing and restraining his nature. The Hornsent regarded horns as sacred. The Golden Order eventually treated them as a curse. That difference becomes especially important when considering Morgott and Mohg. Both were born with omen traits and were hidden beneath Leyndell despite being members of the royal family. Their treatment reflected not only the beliefs of the Golden Order, but also the violent history between Marika and the Hornsent. The consequences of that conflict extended to another of Marika's sons. Mesmer was sent into the Land of Shadow to wage war against the Hornsent. He carried out the campaign in his mother's name, only to be abandoned there afterward. Godfrey's story follows a similar pattern. Marika needed a conqueror, and Hoarah gave her one. He fought her wars, he defeated her enemies, he helped establish the age of the Erd Tree, and when there were no more enemies left for him to conquer, she took his grace and sent him away. Even generations later, echoes of that relationship remain. Miquella's attempt to make Radahn his promised lord reflects another union between a god and an overwhelmingly powerful warrior chosen to stand at their side. The lands between remain scarred by the age Godfrey helped create. Radahn admired the first Elden Lord so deeply that he adopted the lion as one of his defining symbols. Stormvale still stands as a monument to the wars fought during Godfrey's campaigns. Nefeli Lu carries his name into a new generation. His children suffered beneath the order their family helped establish. His kingdom collapsed. His age ended long before he returned. And yet Godfrey himself receives something few characters in this story ever find: closure. The first Elden Lord returns to Leyndell, kneels beside his dying son, and then stands to face one final opponent. He does not beg for his kingdom back. He does not curse Marika. He does not complain about the years he spent in exile. He simply fights. Because beneath the crown, the title, and the lion upon his back, Godfrey was always Hoarah-Loux. And Hoarah-Loux understood the world in the simplest possible terms. If you want the crown, prove you are strong enough to take it.